Okay, Rabbi Say. So, we are getting close to the end of Daf Nun Hey Amud Beis, and today's class is called Talk About Dreams. Why should you talk about dreams? Why should you talk about it? Because, as we're going to find out today, the way the dreams are talked about can make all the difference. We're going to hear about the power of speech and verbalization and articulation, and that is why Talk About Dreams is the title for tonight's episode. This is the 15th consecutive episode about dreams, and we're only scratching the surface, to be sure. In the previous episode, we learned a little bit about different kinds of chalomot, different kinds of dreams, and today we're going to come back to that. We're going to come back to that because the Maharsha is going to explain this Gemara by virtue of three kinds of dreams, and with this he's going to try to deal with seeming contradictions. I just want to say before I start today that there are many shittas. I think there are 9 or 12 ways to learn this Gemara, and one is not like the other. The Baal HaAkeda asks a whole slew of questions, and he comes up with a very unique way of explaining a portion of the Gemara, but it doesn't fit with something the Gemara says earlier, nor does it kind of jibe with what the Gemara says later. Because of this, the Maharsha rejects his approach, and as a rule, when you're learning Gemara, I think you have to kind of find what's called a mahalach. You have to find an approach. You learn the Gemara with a certain approach. You're usually safe with the Maharsha's approach, so I'm going to take the Maharsha's approach. I'm going to include a lot of interesting things from Rishonim and Achronim, from the medieval sages and the later sages, because I think that it's not a contradiction to what we're learning from the Maharsha, but it will augment and further develop. There's no Rashi on this Gemara, very interestingly. There is one Tosfos, a very important Tosfos, with a number of versions, and I think this is going to be a fascinating class, because dreams are fascinating, and the power of speech. There's a lot of very compelling and interesting things that we're going to be touching on today. So with no further ado, the Gemara is found near the bottom of the page, about 10 lines up from the bottom or so. It's the third word on the page. The line begins with the word Yidei. And in the previous Gemara we talked about the angelic advocate who might be bringing you your communication, or some kind of demonic delivery boy. You don't want the latter, but you might get stuck with that. And that makes kind of a difference. We'll talk more about this with Hashem's help as we move away through the Gemara. Okay, so with no further ado, welcome back everybody. And let's do this. Omar Rabbi Bizna. Rabbi Bizna, who was the son Bar Zavda, he said, Omar Rabbi Akiva, the famous Rabbi Akiva taught. But the famous Rabbi Akiva taught this in the name of Rabbi Panda, not to be confused with a kind of bear who's black and white. Anyway, I'm not going to go into who these people were. The most famous of the people who are mentioned here is Rabbi Akiva and his teacher, Rabbi Nochum, who is better known as Nochum Ish Gamzu. Nochum, who always said, everything is great. It's exactly the way it's supposed to be. The rest of the sages here are not widely known. They don't come up often in the Shas. Omar Rebbe Birion. This is a lot of names, by the way, for a little teaching. It's like a lot of names, very unusual. There's like a whole tradition here. Rabbi Bizna Bar Zavda, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Panda, Rabbi Nochum, and finally Rabbi Birs. And all of this is Mishum Zoken Echad. Some elder sage said, well, one second, like we have all these names, and then the original teaching is just from some 8 and some. So the Gemara interjects. The Gemara says, okay, 1 second. Mano, who was this elder sage? And the Gemara says it was Rabbi Banaya. So then this is ultimately a teaching from Rabbi Banaya, but Rabbi Banaya is the person who has the experience. And he comes to a conclusion by virtue of something he saw or observations he made. Call it scientific if you wish. He said, here's what happened to me, here's what I did, this is what I was able to extrapolate from the situation. And because Rabbi Banaya analyzed the situation and came to a certain conclusion, this was considered to be a very authoritative kind of observation, so it gets passed on. He must have told Rabbi Biryam is there, who told Rabbi Nachum, who told Rabbi Panda, who told Rabbi Akiva, who tells Rabbi Bizna, and Rabbi Bizna records it for posterity, and now we know who the teaching comes from. So why are we mentioning Rabbi Banaya? Now, the thing is like this. The thing is that this teaching is not a typical kind of halachic teaching. This is a little bit in the realm of what you would call agadah. It's a little bit like spooky stuff, mysterious things. It's not so typical. So Rabbi Banaya was one of the great sages who lived towards the end of the Mishnaic era. In fact, his star pupil is known as Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is the person who is responsible for the formulation of the Jerusalem Talmud, widely considered the greatest of the first generation of Amoraim, the Torah leader in Israel. Sometimes, however, Rabbi Yochanan is considered to be a Tana. Sometimes he's considered to be in the genre of the Mishnah teachings. That's how important he was. And Rabbi Banaya is his teacher. So this is a little bit of who Rabbi Banaya is. Now, he is mentioned a number of times in the Talmud. He's mentioned in Talmud Bavli, he's mentioned in Talmud Yerushalmi, he's mentioned in the Mechilta, which is the Medrash Halacha that accompanies the first two books of the Torah, and he's mentioned in the Sifri, which is the Medrash Halacha that accompanies the fourth and fifth, the conclusion of the Pentateuch of the 5 books of Moshe Rabbeinu. The interesting thing is that this story is set in Jerusalem, but he's not really an elder of Jerusalem. It sounds like he is, but if you know a little about Rabbi Banaya, you know that he taught Torah in Tiberias, in Tiberia. Rabbi Yochanan was a disciple of his in Tiberia. Now, interestingly, there were people who were living in the Holy Land of Israel, that's clear, but there were also Jews living in Yerushalayim at the time. Even though this is really significantly after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. But there is a Jewish population in Yerushalayim, although it is not necessarily the center of Torah. But probably there's a lot of wise people living there. Very erudite people, mystical people. Till today, there's something called the Jerusalem syndrome. You know, in medical texts. The Jerusalem syndrome, it's in medical textbooks. It's like this, people go to Jerusalem and they think that they're prophets. And they start riding on a white donkey or decide to disrobe and proclaim themselves some kind of savior. It's a real, nobody really understands how, but there's something about, it's called the Jerusalem syndrome. People go there and something about them gets very inspired. Anyway, this story is set, it's not really a story, this episode is set in Yerushalayim, even though Rav Banaya is from Tiberia. And we know that he's from Tiberia because he had a Beis Medrash there. The Beis Medrash, it seems, outlived him. It was still called the Beis Medrash of Rabbi Banaya even after his passing. And Rabbi Yochanan, who taught Torah in Yerushalayim, he often cites many drashas in his name. So what I found most interesting is that Rabbi Banaya is not known for his teachings in halacha. He's known for his teachings in Agadah. That was his expertise. And Agadah is the more midrashic or mysterious part of the Torah. And I think that maybe this plays into it. Maybe this is why the Gemara is saying, this is an observation of Rabbi Banaya. Like, in other words, this was his specialty. Everybody has a specialty. This was his specialty. If this is the conclusion he came to, then, the sages took it very seriously. Now, I'm making all this up. I didn't read this anywhere. I don't know that it's correct or true. I'm sharing with you like this like my thoughts. Rashi doesn't say anything. The Mefarshim don't speak about why it mentioned Rabbi Banaya. I don't know, but I think this is kind of logical. So now that you know who Rabbi Banaya is, and you know what his expertise is, and he's highly regarded, clearly. But he is the origin of this teaching because he has this extraordinary experience, and there's no other way to explain what happened. So you would call it the scientific method, because the scientific method is to create a hypothesis, which is strictly speaking non-scientific, because hypotheses are just postulations. it would seem, we could assume, and science, strictly speaking, means knowledge. So all science begins with a non-scientific approach, meaning it is an educated guess, a logical assumption or guesstimate. But in order for it to become a scientific, really scientific, or what you call euphemistically a scientific fact, although that is a redundancy, because if it's scientific, obviously it's a fact, or at least somewhat factual, is that when you have a controlled study and you have a number of different events and the only common denominator proves to be A, then A is the cause. It can't be B, it can't be C, it can't be D, it can't be X, Y, and Z, because all of these things were present in some but not the other. The only thing that was present in all was A. So A must be the cause. And if it's done in a really exhaustive way, then it's called a good study, it's called a solid study, and then it establishes facts. Now, that doesn't mean that new facts can't come to light. New facts are always coming to light and studies change. But this is kind of like the scientific method that Rabbi Banaya uses in his analysis of what happened, of his experience. And clearly the sages took him very seriously. I made a bracha before. So the Gemara says, Esrim va'arba poisrei chaloimos hoyu b'Yerushalayim. There were 24 dream interpreters that were living in Jerusalem. 24 dream interpreters. That's a lot of dream interpreters. Okay, like, I don't know if they made a living or not, or if this is what they made the living from, but they had a shingle or something like that, and people knew they were dream interpreters. I guess in those days, you're nervous, you had a dream, you went to see an official dream interpreter. Maybe he had a diploma that he graduated from the dream interpretation school. I don't know. Right? But went to see the dream interpreter. I'm joking, by the way, we'll come back to this. So he says, Pam achat, one time, cholamti chalom, I had a dream. Not to be confused with Martin Luther King. I had a dream. V'holachti etzel kulam. I didn't make a speech in Washington. Instead, I went to the dream interpreters. Okay, fine. I had a dream. Went to the dream interpreters. Why did it go to 24 dream interpreters? That's a good question. We'll come back to that soon. Umasha pasar li zeh, lo pasar li zeh. So these are all experts, but none of them interpreted the dream in the same way. All of them interpreted the dream differently. And guess what happened? Guess who was right? The kulam niskai mubi. They were all right. Every one of them was right. Lekayim, this fulfills mashanemar, that which is stated. And this idea of kol hachalomot holchim achar hapeh. That all of the dreams, they follow the way you talk about them. It's all about the way you talk. Follows the mouth. That's what you do with your mouth. You talk. So, in other words, he's not the originator of this teaching. There's this teaching. Kol hachalomot holchem achar hapeh. Rabbi Banaya says, it's true. It's actually so. I went to 24 dream interpreters, and 24 dream interpreters all spoke about or talked about my dreams differently, and everybody's interpretations were fulfilled. So the most obvious question about this Gemara, there's a lot of questions here, but the most obvious question is, if you say that hachalomot holchot achar hapeh, if that's what you say, holchan achar hapeh, so why do you have to go to a dream interpreter for? Go to anybody. Why did you have to have 24 dream interpreters? Go to anybody who's wise and intelligent or creative. Has a little Torah knowledge, a little creativity. He can bake you a cake, tell you something fascinating, weave you a tapestry. Why'd you have to go to an official dream interpreter? What does it even mean, a dream interpreter? Go to creative writers who have knowledge of Torah, who can draw on the wellspring of Torah teaching, and you don't have to go to a dream interpreter. And what does it mean there were 24 dream interpreters? What made them a dream interpreter? There was like dream school or something? What was it? If it was Torah, then all the sages should know it. If it wasn't Torah, so great sage Rabbi Banaya is going to Harvard. No, Harvard's not good anymore. Whatever. The Technion. I don't know. Go to Look, seriously, what does this even mean? That's the most obvious question. Now, Rashi does not say anything, and I can't tell you why, but he doesn't say anything. Maybe he thinks it's so obvious, but the Tosfos is bothered. The Tosfos clearly is bothered by this question. It's a very small little Tosfos. If you look, in general, there's only 2 Tosfos on this page, but it's a tiny little Tosfos. It's a one-line zinger. The Tosfos says something very unusual. He says, what does it mean, Pesach Halomis? Now, I'm going to tell you, and it might be wrong, but I think that the question that's bothering Tosfos is not what does it mean, Pesach Halomis? What do you need Pesach Halomis for? If it's Hakal Hilchanach Rapeh, if it follows the way you talk about it, what do I need dream interpreters for? So Tosfos says, Pirushri, that the Ri explains, the Bitzchok explains, the Mazel Shas Haleda Gorim, that these are people who were born at a certain time, and because they were born at a certain time, this caused them to have success in this area. Ve'ein hadavar tali b'chachma. This is not about wisdom. This is about fortune or luck. So, what does that mean? What, they were born at a certain time, so they automatically know what to say? What is it?
Time of year?
Probably hour of the day. Time of week. Time of month, maybe. So first of all, let me just clarify that when we talk about mazel, there is this idea as ein mazel Yisrael. The Jewish people are not under the sway of mazal, but chochma bagoyim tam, an irrelevant question. Yitzi, hold off with it. Let's talk this through. Yitzi, one of our online viewers, is asking the question whether this has to do with wisdom by the nations. So, the answer is like yes and no, but wisdom by the nations, this is kind of like a spiritual thing. We use terminology in previous episodes like nevuah ktana, like a minor prophecy. So what does that mean? Secular wisdom is actualizing divine benison? Or it doesn't make sense. It actually doesn't seem to add up. So let's take it from the beginning. So what does it mean when we talk about a mazel? There's a halacha in the Shulchan Aruch, and it's widely followed. And this Friday night, it doesn't have to be followed. You don't have to be careful with it. This Friday night. And this class will probably be watched in the future at a different time, but tomorrow is Asara B'Tevis. It's a fast day unless Mashiach comes, which of course is extremely possible, maybe even probable. But if Mashiach Chas v'Shalom doesn't come, by tomorrow we'll be fasting. And the fast ends at nightfall. And different communities will do different things. Some people will not daven Ma'ariv till it's dark, and the people will break their fast a half hour later, or 45 minutes after the fast is over. Some people will daven early, and they'll have Rachmanos on the people, and they'll remind you to say Shema later on in time, and the people will break their fast on time. But there's an interesting discussion in the Shulchan Aruch about a certain hour on Friday night of not making Kiddush in that hour, and it's called Mazel Maidim. So the sages talk about 7 orbits, which are the 7 planets that the ancients talked about, leaving out Plato and Uranus, like the outer, but leaving out the Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune, leaving out that outer orbit. But we talk really about orbits, different orbits. A different orbit means a different area of space, different areas of space. And so Mars occupies one of those areas. It is the orbit in which Mars lives, or Mars is. It's called Mazel. So that's a Mazel Maidim. And the constellations line up in a certain way. And people who know how to look at the stars are able to see the way stars line up. They're able to actually predict certain events. And by the way, this is something that Torah ratifies. Like Avraham Avinu had an issue because he was told that his Mazel indicated that he wasn't going to have children. Hashem says that's correct, but you're above the mazel. By virtue of mazel, you're not going to have children. And when Moshe Rabbeinu was born, the stargazer said he was born today. So Pharaoh said, "Where does he live?" They said, "We don't know." What kind of person is he? Is he blue? Is he black? Is he green? Is he Egyptian? Is he Jewish? He said, "We don't know. We don't know." So that day, Pharaoh threw all the babies in the river. But he didn't know that Moshe Rabbeinu was born and nobody knew about him because he was born premature and his mother kept him in a closet. So nobody knew where he was. But the day of his birth, on Zion Adar, everybody was told. So you can't say there's nothing to this. Incidentally, there is a woman who reads the stars and the planets, and she's very, very popular. She has a huge online following. And she predicted something like 6 months before Donald Trump's victory. She said Donald Trump's going to win. And she said, I'm voting for Kamala Harris, but I know he's going to win. And they said, how do you know? I said, because he identifies as red hair, and I saw Mars coming at that time. I'm telling you, she said, I know for sure he's going to win. She wasn't wrong. And that wasn't the first thing she said. She predicted a whole bunch of things, and she was right every single time. And you can't diss this thing. Jewish people are not supposed to live their lives in accordance with this. But you cannot dismiss it either. And so I'm going to talk about how does that fit into us, the scientifically enlightened 21st century woke climate change people. Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. It's not even a contradiction. It doesn't even have to be a contradiction. By the way, I don't mean to chas v'shalom confuse people who are very scientifically inclined with people who have insane ideologies. That whatever. I'm not trying to mix that all up. Don't let me alienate anybody out there. I'm sorry if I offended you. Fine. Okay, so it says like this. It says that this mazel it's prone to certain negative things, because it's prone to certain negative things. So we shouldn't make kiddush during this hour. Now, it seems to me, if you look in Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, and many people have concurred with me, although my son argues with me about this, that if you look in Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, he seems to say that when you come home, you make kiddush right away. And I remember as a boy, growing up as a teenager, Crown Heights, that everybody didn't go home when they finished davening Friday between 6 and 7. So they didn't go home between 6 and 7. People used to stay in shul and learn. I remember everybody learning. There was a sikha came out, a weekly sikha that they had edited, the Likut it was called. Everybody stayed and learned the Likut. I remember that throughout my adolescence. You probably remember that also, right? Why would everybody stay and learn the Likut then? Nobody was hungry? They were. You don't make kiddush from 6 to 7. But the Alter Rebbe seems to say, when you come home, you make kiddush right away. Okay. So why doesn't it apply tomorrow night? So tomorrow night, it's going to be a lot of people who come home, and it's going to be between 6 and 7. So I have to go hungry for another hour. So that's crazy. That's crazy because it's a minhag. And the Alter Rebbe says, to begin with, we should follow this, it's a mystical tradition. But it's a halacha in Shulchan Aruch, this business of mazel. Now, so what does it mean, a mazel? What does it mean? It means that there are certain energies that influence us. The energies that influence us do not necessarily mean that we have to be a certain way. But it means we have a predisposition. Another example where this is talked about in Shulchan Aruch is a person who's born in Mazel Maidim. Mazel Maidim is different, by the way, every single day. But a person born in Mazel Maidim, that person should consider becoming a mohel, a person who performs Brit Milah, what the world calls circumcision, or a shochet, a person who is a ritual slaughterer, and we should have kosher meat, or a physician. Why? Because he has a predisposition to spilling blood, so he should do it in a healthy way. Right? Because otherwise, spilling blood can be a negative thing. Does that mean that the person doesn't have any freedom of choice? Of course, it doesn't mean that. A person always has freedom to choose. If your parents are alcoholics, and their parents are alcoholics, and their grandparents were alcoholics, you have a very high chance of being an alcoholic. It's not just a nurture thing; it's actually a nature thing, and the most amazing field of genetic science is called epigenetics. Like this is like the latest and the wildest the kind of discoveries they've made is that people can change their genetic makeup and pass it on. So repetitive behavior actually becomes part of your DNA. And they say that people who were survivors, some of those experiences were seared into the DNA. They actually passed some of these things on to their children. It wasn't just a nurture thing. It's actually a nature thing. Whether people hoard or do other things. It becomes like a nature. Does that mean that if somebody comes from generations of alcoholics that he or she has to be an alcoholic? No. It means that he or she has a greater disposition to falling prey to that kind of compulsive and obsessive behavior. So once you know that, what should you do? Now you know what to look out for. You have to be very careful not to fall into obsessive kind of or compulsive addictive behavior. Because, addictions are a whole separate subject, what causes addictions, but you should know that these things, you have a predisposition. A famous question that's asked that Esau from the womb was already trying to go out to the womb to worship idols. And Yaakov from the womb is already getting excited when he went by yeshiva. So the famous question is, so Esau never had a chance. Why is he a bad guy? It's like he never had a fighting chance to do anything right? So the Rebbe says it's not true. It's not true. Esau had an extraordinary opportunity to be even a greater tzaddik than Yaakov. He chose not to. What about the disposition? So the Rebbe cites a teaching of Maimonides, of the Rambam, in Shemona Prakim, where the Rambam describes two people's natures. Somebody is called a chassid hama'ula, which means a person who is naturally inclined to doing good things. Somebody's called a mizgaber al yitzrei. He has the ability to overcome his inclination. And the mizgaber al yitzrei, the person who has the ability to overcome his or her inclination, has the ability to serve Hashem with greater velocity. It's like a really taut bow. When you pull the string back and phew, when you let it go, it really flies. Right? But that tension doesn't diminish the velocity of the arrow that's shot. It increases it. So nobody has what we're going to call no choice in life. Nobody's life is made up for them, especially if it's Torah mitzvahs. But we could have an inclination. And if we have an inclination, if we develop that inclination, then we're usually going to be pretty good at it. There are people who are born with talent, and people who are not. There's these acrobats, circus performers that I've met coming from the former Soviet Union who tell me that their great-great-great-grandparents, like 7, 8, 9 generations ago, were performing for the Tsar and the Tsarina. These are families of acrobats. And okay, so there's a nurture element. That's what they're born doing. It's also a nature element. They're very athletic. These people really, they have a predisposition. And eventually it becomes like a certain second nature. Does it mean that everybody born in that family is going to be an acrobat? No. Are any of them acrobats without practice? No. Are there people who have a natural gift for music? Yes. Does anybody become a great musician without practice? Certainly not. Certainly not. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. But you have a predisposition. And if you don't have talent to begin with, you're never going to be great. Nobody's great without talent. But nobody's great only by virtue of talent. And in the same way that's not unscientific, because it's a matter of fact that some people have a talent for certain things and some people don't. The notion that every human being starts with the same opportunities is patently ridiculous and scientifically wrong. It's just not true. You have a person with a tremendous IQ, a person who's absolutely brilliant. You have a person who's really dim. They don't have a tremendous IQ. So, well, if you work hard, you'll become a professor. You'll become a great Talmud Chacham. That's actually not correct. And it's unreasonable. It kills a kid because he thinks he's a failure. The kid next to him is doing so well, and he's not doing well. Why am I not doing well? I'm working just as hard. I'm working harder than him. You don't have a predisposition for that. Now let's go back to the Tosfos. Let's look at the Tosfos. What does the Tosfos say? Tosfos says, the mazel shos halei gorim. There's a certain element of genetics or talent, and there's a certain element of, when you're born in a certain mazel, you're born at a certain time, that represents a certain spiritual force, and that spiritual force has an influence. We're not talking here about talent. This is not a question of creativity or talent. It's a question of having some kind of predisposition. I would call it even some kind of clairvoyance. Is it unscientific if you see that somebody has a certain perception for it, let's say? They somehow, they pick up on people. They know, this guy's no good. He's no good. I'm telling you he's no good. And you find out later he's no good. How'd you know? I don't know. Or they have an ability, an uncanny sense of relating to people. They know when somebody's offended. They know when somebody's in a bad mood. They know when somebody's lonely. They know how to pick them out of a room. There's some people that have charisma. They know how to connect to people. So somebody will come along and say, well, scientifically speaking, we'll put all the pieces together, it doesn't add up. Why? Well, how does this person have that uncanny ability? How does he seem to always to know that? This is not a talent, but it is a certain gift. Certain gift. I mentioned this in a previous episode. I once heard from Rabbi Shachat that he met some people who seemed to have this clairvoyance about them. They seem to know things. Like And so he spoke to his uncle, Rabbi Chodakov, who was the Rebbe's private secretary. He was a brilliant, insightful person, extremely knowledgeable person. He worked like the Rebbe's right hand. So Rabbi Shachar told me, he asked his uncle, like, what do I do with this? Like, these people are not holy, but somehow they seem to know things. So Rabbi Shachar said to me that Rabbi Chodakov said that there is such a thing, and some people are born with a gift. Some people have a certain gift. So to understand this Tosfos better, you have to look in the Tosfos HaRosh. Because in the Tosfos HaRosh sometimes will have very similar teaching to Tosfos, but Rabbeinu Asher put it slightly differently. So I'm going to read to you the Tosfos HaRosh, because the Tosfos HaRosh, he elaborates here in a very interesting way. He says, Nira, listen to his words. So our Tosfos is very, very short. Our Tosfos just says, Mazel Shas Halei de Gorim. Tosfos HaRosh says, and I'm quoting, Nira Sha'adavar Talui B'Shah U'B'Mazel Shenoiled Bay. It seems, he says, that this has something to do with the hour and the zodiac that a person is born under the sway of a certain energy. Shepisrin Chalamoisav Miskaimim. That the talking of the dreams, his talk about dreams, seems to have an influence. V'loi hakoil b'roiv chachmasei. It's not all his creativity. It's not only his wisdom. There's something besides the wisdom. Ve'ilu noldu b'mazel, ve'elu, pardon me, noldu b'mazel liftach halaymes. So this is it's a tiny nuance changed, but it's a very important little change. Because what he says is that it's not because they have a good fortune, a certain power, they have the power to co-opt dreams or to actualize dreams. He says it's not only their wisdom. It's a gift in addition to their creativity and wisdom. They seem to have a certain gift. They're able to connect to a certain energy, and they're able to be a conduit by virtue of speaking about the dreams. In the Tosfos of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, which is a later version of similar teachings in Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid's yeshiva, he taught the Gemara, and later there was Tosfos that were attributed to Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. Again, similar teachings, Germany, Alsace-Lorraine, France, it's all Eastern Europe. This is the teaching of Tosfos. In the Tosfos of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, it says that the mazel of the hour in which the person was born is goyrem, becomes a cause. It's a very powerful word, a cause. A cause doesn't mean, it's not the only cause, that it's a cause. It's a cause. Sheyiskayim hachaloimes bisfasav acharapeh. It follows the mouth. Follows the mouth. So, in other words, like this. You need to have a bit of a talent for this. There's certain people that have a mazel, a certain gift. But even if you have that gift, you have to verbalize it. Whatever it is that you're going to do insofar as interpret the dream, you have to speak it out. Yeah, it has to be verbalized. It has to be verbalized. So there's a fascinating tshuva from the Rashba, Rabbeinu Shlomo ben Avram ben Aderet, the great leader in his day of the Spanish Torah community. And the Rashba says like this. He wrote the responsa in addition to his commentary in the Talmud. He was also a physician, by the way. So the Rashba writes in Siman Tov Ches, which is chapter or like entry 408. He says like this. With regard to this Gemara of like verbalization and the powers of verbalization, he says this Gemara stands as the response to the scientific community. Now, the scientific community was not called scientists at the time. They were called the philosophical community, the rational community. In those days, philosophy was the big thing. It wasn't called science. I'm not sure. I know science is a Greek word, but you don't hear about the scientific community like in the 4th and 5th centuries. But you heard about the philosophers, the rational community. So he says the rational community, the philosophical community, says everything follows nature. Don't tell me about this mystical mumbo-jumbo. It follows nature. So he says, Lefi hanira, by virtue of what we can see from the verses of the Torah, and that's based on revelation, not rationalization or observation. And the Chachmei HaTorah seem to follow this understanding. there are certain what he calls segulot. Segulot are freely translated as prohibitions. Certain things, he says. Dvarim ne'elomim, things which are mysterious, literally hidden. Velonid baralonu atasibasim, we don't know how they work. We don't know where they work. And he says this is the meaning of the phrase or saying that our sages said, Brit kruta lisfasayim. There's a covenant to the lips. There's a power in speech. Have you heard the expression, a self-fulfilling prophecy? There's something, don't say everything. They said, Kishgaga hayotza milpnei hashalat. People said something and said, what do you have to say that for? Don't verbalize it. Don't let it escape your lips. And he says, there's things that have certain, whether people call them talismans or propitians. And there's something about speech. He says there's a famous statement which is made in the Gemara Masechet Megillah that says, Al tia berches hedyet kala beinecha. Let the blessing of a simple person not be light. Not be light. Somebody gives you a blessing, say Amen. You never know. Somebody said something. That's fine. Thank you. Words are powerful things. So the Rashba, I love this. The Rashba was a physician himself. He was a great philosopher. He was a member of the scientific community. He said, so you want to look at this scientifically, eh? You want to be like rational about this. Michal David is mentioning here that many people went to Rabbi Shachat for a dream interpretation. I can tell you for a fact that's true. I heard him interpret dreams many, many times. Many times when we were sitting learning together, he would interpret dreams. I don't know. People seemed to like this. They felt that he had some kind of knack for that. Anyway, back to the Rashba here. I love what he says. He says, people are going to say, Ma toil ha-bracha. What did this person give a bracha? What is that? What does it make a difference if somebody said A or B or Y or Z? Come on, what difference does it make? What are they, God? But the Rashba says, it's a funny thing. People get nervous, and we have this famous phrase, Al tiftach pela satan. Don't open a mouth, so to speak, to the forces that seek to obstruct. That's what the satan literally means, an obstruction, obfuscation. But this is what I love. He says, Gam chachmei hafilosufim einam yochelim litin tam lesgulas haniglas lein koil. Even the scientific community can explain all phenomenon. He says, how do you explain the magnetic pull? They can't. Do they have to explain it? It's a fact. It's a fact. How did they explain chemical reactions? It's a matter of fact. How do they explain the realities of suspension, geometric realities, the realities of flotation, of shipbuilding? Now you take something with enormous weight, it weighs tens of thousands of tons, and it floats on the ocean because of the way it's made, and it doesn't sink. How does that work? So, there's a whole explanation. I understand the whole explanation. And the whole explanation in the end is based on that's nature. So he says, very nice. Okay, fine. So that's nature. So nature is that there's a power given to speech. Do you know why this herb coagulates blood? Or this herb somehow has a way of diminishing pain? Or thins the blood? I mean, aspirin is made from the bark of a tree. It's very scientific. Okay. So why does it? Well, that's the chemical reaction. Sounds very scientific. Why? It's the way it is. It's the way it is. So he says all of science in the end is based on observation of facts. He says, okay, fine. That's exactly what Rav Banaya did. He based his observation on the facts. He has a dream. He goes to 24 dream interpreters. 24 dream interpreters all say something, and it happens like every one of them says. This is clear. There's something about what they said. There's got to be something to it. Now, if you want to talk about this in more Cabalistic language, so the Ben Ish Chai in the Ben Yehoyada, he says some really wild stuff here. He says that we know that we say Hakal Helech Achar Hapeh. Everything goes after Hapeh, right? Okay. So he says there are basically three areas of endeavor that a human being can live within three areas. There's the moyach, there's the brain, and that's what you think with. There's the mouth, and that's what you speak with. And he says, and then there's the hands, and that's what you act with. Well, it's very reminiscent of what says in Chassidus and Tanya, but that terminology comes from Kisvei HaArizal, straight Kisvei HaArizal, and the Kisvei HaArizal has a lot of similarity to things that says in Chovos HaLevavos. The Chovos HaLevavos speaks about Machshava Dibur Maisa without calling it Machshava Dibur Maisa. In general, the Ben Yehuda says many things which line up with Chassidus. He was nostalgic the year the Rebbe was born, and his method of learning Gemara is very similar. The Rebbe's teaching of Agad is very similar to Ben Yehuda and to the Binyo. That's just my personal observation, and maybe I'm wrong, but that seems to me. And he was a very, very unusual man, the Ben Ish Chai. He mixes together Kabbalah and Nigla and philosophy. It's all like what it all goes together. So he says that we have this Shloisha Mekaymis Yesh Beguf. There are three literally locations in the body. He says, and there's Gimel Pi'ilos. There's three areas of endeavor. Moyach, brain. Okay, he says, yes, that's Machshava. Peh, that's Poil Hadibur. And then he says Yudai. And he says, Lozeh Omar Holchen Achar Peh. It follows after the mouth. In other words, he says something incredible here. He says that after a person speaks about it, then a person can write it. Michal David says the Rebbe was 6. He passed away in 1907, Michal David? I thought he passed away in 1901. 1902, pardon me. Okay, whatever. Very, very similar, very little overlap. So he says, what does it mean? He says, what do people write? First they think about it, then they verbalize it, then they write it. A lot of times, writers like to speak things through first. So we'd like to speak things through. So he says, and here's fascinating. Let's listen to this. So he says that when we talk about the Cabalistic kind of configuration, the Cabalistic ideas and the various names of God which are symbolic of divine engagement with our world. So he says, we know that the Shem Elokim is the number of the gematria of 86. Elokim with a hey spells out 86. So he says, Misper Pei Vav, number 86 comes after number 85. Hakoil hoilech achar hapeh. He says everything follows the mouth. Action, Elokim, is Hashem's judgment, Hashem's creation. Bereshis bara Elokim. So everything follows the mouth. 86 follows 85. You like that? It's wild, huh? And then he says something else amazing. He says, we know that when things are brought into this world, that the configuration in Kabbalah is the shame of Kael Adnai. Aleph Lamed Kael, we pronounce it Kael, and Adnai, Aleph Daled Nun Yud, which I'm purposely mispronouncing. Kael Adnai brings, that's the name of God through which things are actualized, through which Elokim actualizes. So he says, Kael Adnai has the numeric equivalent of 96. Tzadik Vav. What's the letter after Pei? Tzadik. What's the letter after Hey? Vav. Tzadik Vav. So he says, according to Kabbalah, Kael Adnai actualizes what comes, so to speak, after the Peh. So if you want it to be actualized, the name of God that brings it in is Shem Elokim. Is 86, Achar HaPeh, right after 85. And he says, Kael Adnai is what brings things down. That's what brings conventions into this world. That's Tzadik Vav. Tzadik is after Pei. Vav is after Hey. Acharei HaPeh, Acharei HaPei. And Acharei HaHei is Tzadik and Vav. Again, it's very Cabalistic. That's fascinating. So he says, the letters Tzadik Vav come after Pei Hey. And this is the meaning, he says, in spiritual terminology, or in spiritual chemistry, of Hachal Heilach Achar HaPeh. And now, we come to the big question. And this is the big question I didn't speak about till now. Okay, we had Rashba, we had the Tosfos, very nice. Here's the big question. Okay, so everything goes after the way it's spoken about. What's up with the 24 different interpretations? Why did he need 24 different interpreters to come to this conclusion? He should have gone to somebody, had the dream interpreted. He says, look at that. And if he needed to do it a lot of times, then he should have had a number of different occasions where he had a dream, got it interpreted. He said, 24 times in a row, I went to different interpreters, and every time what they said is what happened. It said the emphasis here was he had a chalom in one night, and he went to 24 different interpreters, pam achat, one time, chalom chalamti, pardon me, v'halachti etzel kulam. What's the emphasis on it coming after, so to speak, 24 interpretations of the same dream? And probably if there were 25 professionals in Yerushalayim, he might have had 25. I don't know. There just happened to be 24. So the Ben Yehoyada has a fascinating resolution to this extremely important question. And he says like this. He asked the question, he says, Davar Yapoli. This is like shocking, so astonishing. Mimanavshach. If from heaven there's one way that's right, so that's right, finished. But what's up with the 24 different interpretations? So the Ben Yehoyada says, I'll tell you. This is a tough one, he says. But yesh lidchik. Maybe I'm thinking. Shera nusach echad chov dalet pamim. He saw one basic dream 24 times. So he went to get it interpreted 24 times because it was in 24 different itim. It was in 24 different times of the night. And every time has a different mazal. So he went with 24 different mazalot to 24 people who have a predisposition in order to be able to interpret it, and everything worked out. So that it says it's like the same way that people are born in a certain mazal that gives them an ability to interpret dreams, the same way the dream itself, it came to you in a certain time, it also represents a certain energy. So that's the Ben Yehoyada's suggestion. But I found a different suggestion, which I personally like much more. I'm going to share it with you. And that is a teaching from not from the Ben Yehoyada, but from the Eini Yitzchak. The Eini Yitzchak suggests the following. Rav Banaya had one very long dream. Very long dream. So he went to the first guy and he said, interpret my dream. And of course we know that every dream has Devarim B'Telim, has things which are not relevant. That's the nature of a dream. And you have to know which part of the dream is relevant, which part of the dream is not relevant. We'll talk about that a little later on with teaching from the Mittel Rebbe and Teres Chaim. You have to know which part of the dream is relevant. So he said, each interpreter zeroed in on a part of the dream and said, this part of the dream, this resonates with me, this means X, Y, and Z. But Rav Banaya himself felt that there was other parts of the dream that still needed to be interpreted. He felt himself that there was something more, there was something else. So he went to the next dream interpreter. The next dream interpreter was able to latch onto a different part of the dream and say, okay, I think this part is a meaningful part. And he ended up extracting 24 meaningful messages out of a single long dream. And guess what? They all came true. Bobby, I'm teaching the Talmud. This is the Gemara, Masechet Brachot, and I can't really explain more, but you can Google Talmud and you'll know what I'm teaching, or at least about what I'm teaching. So this is this really, and to me this resonates. This is it's a fascinating concept. That's mamash fascinating, and therefore Rav Banaya said it was like scientific. He said, I had this dream, different pieces. There were 24 meaningful elements of that dream, 24 meaningful, like self-standing kind of messages out of one long narrative, one long dream, and they all came true. So he says that's the proof. Now, the big problem that we're left with in all this, I mean, the real challenge for us to understand is sometimes we say that a person could just say a pasuk and doesn't have to get it interpreted. And sometimes you have to be getting interpreted. And sometimes anybody can say it and it doesn't make a difference. And Yosef says, when the Pharaoh asks him for interpretation, Yosef says, me? I should interpret. God has interpretations. What do you want from me? So how does that work? How does that work? So the Maharsha says like this. The Maharsha says that the Bala Akeda asks many, many important questions, including the questions I just articulated on this Gemara. And the Bala Akeda gives a very creative approach to this whole thing. He said, but it doesn't fit with the sugya of the Gemara. It doesn't fit with the actual topic of the Gemara. So how are we to understand this? So therefore the Maharsha says there are, based on the things we learned previously, he said basically there are three kinds of dreams. There are dreams which he says are primarily benign. They come like, like you're connecting on some level. We called it a demon, means like a force, there's some kind of spiritual force that you're connecting with. But it's not terribly meaningful. And it could be actualized. It's something that could be actualized. So he said that's one kind of dream. That's one kind of reality. And there too we say Haro'eh, but there's a different set of variables. Then the Maharsha says there's chalomes that come through angelic agency. And the angelic agency, he says, this is more pronounced. It's more direct. But the way it's interpreted is going to make all the difference. And for that you need like a really like the big interpreters and so on and so forth. And that's our story of our Gemara. Then he says we have the dreams which are literally like a nevuah, like a prophecy. And he said dreams like that don't really need much interpretation. Doesn't need it. Interpretation plays a role, but a very minor role. It's like he says, this is like the dreams of Joseph himself. So the dreams of the butler and the baker, the dreams of the Pharaoh are dreams that needed interpretation, needed to be articulated. The dreams of Joseph himself don't need to actually be articulated, although he wanted them to be articulated, and that's why he got his brothers to say what it is. But he says the dreams that are like mamash, like Yosef's dreams himself, that dream is like that doesn't require much work at all. And so he breaks it into three categories. And the Maharsha says when you look at it in these three categories, depending on which piece of Gemara we're learning, you fit it in. I mean, the beautiful thing is that it all follows the concept of Haro'eh. It all follows that articulation, verbalization, talk about dreams has a powerful impact. Has an impact. Now, if this is the case, so if you don't like what you heard, go to somebody else and get him to talk about it. It's not so pashut. Because the Ritva tells us in Masechet Tanit on Daf Yud Beis, the Gemara speaks there about fasting and the permission to fast on Shabbos. And in general, you should know the Mefarshim say if you're going to fast, you have to fast like right away. Can't wait for later. It's like it has to be dealt with immediately. And he says that it's true that kol hachaloimos are holchen achar hapeh. He says that's true. But he says once you got an interpretation and you're not like happy with it, or it's not working for you, or it doesn't talk to you, then in that case, there's no point in getting more interpretations. It's not like you don't like this one, go to the next one. He says, once it talks to you, that's it. So with the Pharaoh, none of the interpretations talk to him. So that's why we had the Mefarshim say, the Pharaoh, they made all kinds of interpretations, but it has to talk. It has to talk to the patient, talk to the dreamer. If it doesn't talk to the dreamer, it doesn't work. But if it does talk to the dreamer, and it gets interpreted, and it's not good, then the tshuva, then coming closer to Hashem, is the methodology to bring the bracha, or to do away with the negative energy that's coming your way. And this idea that the Ritva speaks about is actually clearly spelled out in the teachings of the Or HaChaim. Or HaChaim, in Genesis 37, verse 7, he speaks about the dreams of Joseph. So Joseph has two sets of dreams. And the first dream is we're gathering sheaves. And he also says, Shimu no hachalom hazeh asher chalomti. He says, hey brothers, can you please listen to this dream? Why does he have to say Shimu no? Especially when he knows they don't want to listen to him. He's not very popular. So the Haro'eh says, first of all, he says no because they don't want to listen to him. So he said, please listen to me. Come on, please listen to me. Another way of understanding this is, he says that I need you to listen to me, because as I mentioned before, Iker Pisur HaChalom Hu Dafka Biyomo. The main thing is in the day of. And I have nobody else to talk to right now. So you guys, you need to listen. Please, you need to do this. And in fact, if you learn it this way, then the word no doesn't mean please, but the word no means now. So it's like, now listen to me. Now is the time. And then he says, but there's an element of, he's genteel, he's being very polite, please, and so on and so forth. And he says, another element of this, he was trying to tell them, this is important. It's not like I got this interpreted already. You are the ones who can interpret this. I need you to do this. Your words are going to make the difference. So I need you to speak about this. And he says, I didn't get it done already, because then it would just be wasting my time. They'd just be taunting you. That's the famous question. Now, Barbanel and others discuss, why was Joseph doing this? If you know you're not popular, what are you going to tell them? You had dreams of grandeur, that you're going to be the king and everybody's bowing down to you? And the answer is Joseph has to get this interpreted. And they're the ones who are going to interpret it. And what do they say? They say, what do you think? You're going to be a king over us? Thank you very much, says Joseph. That's exactly what I thought this dream was about. Exactly. And then, Hamalach Timlech Aleinu. Some of the Mefarshim say that's why it took 22 years. Because they said, you think we're going to happen? So it took a long time. Then he has Vayachalom Od Chalom. You go to Genesis 37, verse 9. He had another dream, right? And he told his brothers. And he said, I had another dream. And there's the sun and the moon. And there's 11 stars. And they're all bowing to me. And they don't say anything. The brothers, they say nothing. I think the Panei Rosa says this. So he says, what's verse 10? Vayisaper el Oviv. He told his father. His father said, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? How could I and your mother come? And Yosef says, exactly what I thought. Yes, you also see the son as the father. You also see the moon as the mother. Yes, 11 children. Yes, exactly. So the Panei, I think it's Panei Rosa, he says, if my memory serves me correctly, he says because the brothers didn't interpret the second dream. The brothers don't speak. So after the brothers don't speak in verse 9, that's when he goes to his father. He doesn't want to tell this to his father. He doesn't want to bother his father. He doesn't want to tell his father. It's disrespectful. But this time his father is in the dream, and the brothers don't want to interpret it. So he has no choice but to tell it to his father, and his father interprets it. But Yosef knows this is the case. So we see, like the Maharsha says, even when it's actually a prophecy, even then the talk about the dream helps. But as we learn from the Tosfos, you have to have an energy for this. Now, very interestingly, the Rebbe explains the Pirkei Rebbe Lezer. Rebbe Lezer says in Pirkei Rebbe Lezer, it says that when he heard these words, Yaakov wrote down be'eza makom be'eza shah, exactly where he was at what time. When he wrote it down. But this fits very nice. And the Rebbe said, what's going on there? Why is he writing down? And the Rebbe says, because Yaakov was afraid if maybe there was a part of the interpretation that didn't work because he said it in a tone that was incredulous, as the Mefarshim say, the incredulous Havoi Novai actually delayed it for 22 years. So Yaakov said, I want to make sure that I'm writing it down as a form of expression, which fits so nicely with the Ben Yehoyada, Achar HaPeh. He says, after the mouth comes the writing. So after Yaakov Avinu said, Havoi Novai, he went and wrote it. Biyomzu, Bishazu, he wrote that in the hour. He wrote like the Mazel kind of thing. So this is the story of the Gemara. Now, there's a phenomenal mimer from the Mittler Rebbe in Teres Chaim, where the Mittler Rebbe talks about Yosef's power to interpret. But before we go on to the actual power of interpretation, I want to go a little bit further in the Gemara, because the Gemara says, okay, fine, this is very scientific. It's, Rav Banaya analyzes the situation, came with a conclusion. He said, but is there any kind of pasuk for this? Because the Gemara, the Talmud is always going to say it's very interesting. It fits with the principles we know, but we want to see. Michal David makes an interesting comment. This is similar to writing a pan and then reading it at the oil. Maybe, nishpashat. Maybe. So he says, Otu kolach haleimes hilchen achar hapeh, says the Gemara. Really? So is that really so? All of the dreams follow how you talk about them? Is it all talking about dreams? So the Gemara says, yeah. The Gemara says, yeah. Actually, yes. Krohu, is it a verse? Do we have this in the scripture? Because everything has to be alluded to in the scripture. The Gemara says, yes, it is a scripture. It is a scripture. And the scripture is, Uked Rabbi Elazar follows the teaching, the homily of Rabbi Elazar about a verse in the scripture that speaks about dream interpretation. The Omer Rabbi Elazar said, Minayin shekol hachalomot holchin achar hapeh. How do you know that all interpretations come to be by virtue of how they're spoken about? How do you know it follows the way it's talked of? He says, Shenemar, because it says, when the royal courtier, the baker, said to the Pharaoh, when the Pharaoh was going out of his mind that nobody could interpret his dream, so he says, I don't want to mention this. It's not exactly a shining point in my career. It's chatoy ani masker, I slipped up. I ended up in prison. It was a kid. He was practically an idiot. But he seemed to have a gift of interpreting dreams. Our sages tell us, you see how wicked this person was, what a wicked man he was. You can't even speak about somebody in a complimentary way. Even when he's giving him a compliment, it's like a backhanded criticism to make sure that he doesn't experience any success. He's trying to make sure, like even if he'll make the Pharaoh happy, don't appoint him to any position of importance. Yeah, a little Jew, like a dirty Jew, like a nar, eved, ivri, an idiot. And he says, what did he say? Vahi kasher posar lonu kein hoya. The way he said it, that's what it was. So it's not, the Rabbi Elazar says, it's not just what he said. It's not just how he talked about it. Because he talked about it. Because he talked about it. That's the point. Yes, he talked about it. Kasher posar. As he said it, so it was. As he talked about the dream, so the dream happened. And Amar Rava says about this, yes, for who? The mifshar le me'ein chalme. But when you talk about it, it has to be something that relates to the dream itself. If it doesn't relate to the dream, and if it doesn't talk to the dreamer, it's not going to accomplish anything. Shenemar, we know this because it says, Ish kechalomo posar. He was able to interpret each person according to his interpretation. And how do we know this? Because it says, Vayar sar ha'oifim, the baker saw that Yosef had interpreted well. How did he see it interpreted well? And the answer was because the baker saw how Yosef interpreted the dream for the butler, for the guy with the wine. So the baker said, oh, I like this. So you interpreted that really well. What do you say about my dream? And Yosef said, oh, your dream is not very good. Mr. Baker, you're not going to be, you're leaving prison, but not with your head on your shoulders. So how did he know? Mino Yoda, how did the baker know? He knew how to make French bread. How did he know how to make Egyptian bread? How did he know? Amar Rabbi Elazar says, Malami, this teaches us shekol echad v'echad Haro'eh chalomo or pisron chalomo shel chaveri. Each one of these two, the butler and the baker, each one had his own dream, and each one also somehow dreamed the interpretation of the other. So he knew. It resonated. It resonated with him. But if it resonated with him and it was so simple, why did Yosef have to speak about it? And why does he have to say, Vahi kasher pasar? So from this, the Gemara says this is because Yosef was able to zero in and see what was right and what was wrong. But more importantly, kasher pasar, the way he talked about it. Now here, there's an incredible teaching of the Mittler Rebbe, Al Pi Chassidus. With the Mittler Rebbe, this is a mimer actually in Parshas Vayechi, this week's Torah portion. And in the mimer, he talks about the uniqueness of Joseph, of Yosef HaTzadik, vis-a-vis the rest of his brothers. And he says, how could it be the brothers didn't recognize Joseph? How could it be? You know, recognize your own brother. And they were tzaddikim. They couldn't recognize that this wasn't a pagan. Didn't see that he was refined. They couldn't see a neshama here. And he explains the spiritual level of the rest of the Shvatim and explains the spiritual level of Yosef. And he says it was on a totally different level. He said, Yosef, there's an element, there's a world of order. It's called tikkun. It's a world of chaos. It's called tohu. And they were a world of order, where things had to follow a certain order, and they had things lined up. And this is the way to serve Hashem in a predictable, natural, consequential fashion. And then there's tohu. There's like wild, the wild card, and unpredictable, and highs and lows. Very hard to live with people like that. That didn't work. They thought that was ridiculous, right? And Yosef was not tohu or tikkun. He was higher. He was able actually to marshal the energy of tohu and marry it to the order of tikkun. So you could take the wildest of energy. He was living in a tempest, like affairs of state, and he was totally focused. Didn't lose himself. Was able to channel things and remain focused. And remain choreographed in the midst of what none of his brothers could ever have imagined. So Yosef is tzaddik elyon, a higher tzaddik. And the Mittel Rebbe says that Yosef has the ability to deal with something called klipat noga. Klipat noga is the soid eitz hadas. It's called the secret of the tree of knowledge. The sin of the tree of knowledge is that we have a mixture of good and bad. And that's the problem with klipat noga. Klipa, the husk, the shells, external things, they're only created to be discarded. Like the peel of your banana, which is there for you to throw it out when you're ready to eat the fruit. It's just a peel. It's bad. It's nothing good about it. The shell of the egg. Nobody chews on the shells. The shells there to protect the egg. Once the egg is cooked, you peel the shell, you get rid of it. That's fine. That's klipa. Then there's an element of a skin, a covering, which can be used. So with enough paprika, you can turn the chicken skin into a delectable part of the chicken dinner, or something like that. Like, they take little bits and figments of meat and turn it into hot dogs and salami. So, and people love it. People, so they're taking, in other words, something which could be discarded, but if it's harnessed right, you can actually use it. And this is klipat noga. Most of the world, by the way, has a lot of klipat noga. Most things in the world are not bad or good. If they're not godly, they're not good. But if you turn it into in a godly way, in a meaningful way, in a purposeful way, it can become good. Metal implements, sharp knives, can be used in a surgery to save life or by a murderer to kill. It can be used for a brit milah, or it can be used to slash somebody. Like the knife is not bad. The gun that kills the Nazi is an article of goodness. It's saving innocent lives. It's not guns that kill people, it's bad people that kill people. People are utilizing something which is neither good nor bad, depends what you use it for. So this is the idea of klipat noga. Now Yosef's dream is pure prophecy and doesn't have to be picked apart, and there's nothing extraneous in Yosef's dream, so it's all good. The dream of the butler and the baker, the dream of the Pharaoh, is full of contradictions. There's things which are relevant, things which are not relevant, things which are meaningful. Now for the Pharaoh himself, it's not really about him. It wasn't a personal message to him, it was a message to the world. The Pharaoh, as the regent, the most powerful monarch in the world, was getting a message from God of how he should save the world. He had millions of lives in his hands. So Hashem gives him the gift, and Yosef is the one who interprets it. And that's where Yosef's gift comes, because Yosef is able to balance worlds. Yosef is able to synergize. Yosef is able to see how to bring it all together. And he says that's why the word patar, which means to interpret, is the same Hebrew words as topher, to sew together. So Yosef has the ability to see this, and nobody else could see this. And that's why he says it's all by the virtue of, it's a gift from God. It's by virtue of the gifts of God, but this was Yosef's gifts, and when he uses those gifts well, so he interprets the dreams in amazing things. I'm synopsizing this mimer over. That's the point that I made here in Teres Chaim. At any rate, we learned all about, talk about dreams. And Be'ezrat Hashem, in our next episode, we're going to talk about what I'm going to call dream scenarios. First, we're going to talk about another scenario with not even an active dream, but just on the cusp of subconsciousness or coming to how another method that Hashem could send messages to us. And then we'll talk about dream scenarios, play out the scenarios of different dreams to see what dream could be meaningful, what dream is not meaningful. And then from there, we're going to go into a fascinating series of dream interpretations, as you'll see, in which there's a difference by virtue of how the dreams are interpreted and so on and so forth. Anyway, as I say, to be continued. For those who are just joining for the first time, can you please subscribe? And of course, share with your family and friends. And those who are already subscribed, thank you. Please share. Please get others to subscribe. Let's spread the message of Torah and of Yiddishkeit and of spirituality and of inspiration. And I will end with the hope and the prayer that Galut, which is metaphorized as a dream, should come to an end. And not by talking about the dream of Galut, but by talking about the dream of redemption. A different kind of dream, right? And it's interesting, and I'll finish with this, that the Kabbalists say, I heard this from the Rebbe, that the Kabbalists say that the word Mashiach is the same Hebrew letters as the word Masiach. If you move the dot from the right of the shin to the left, it goes from Mashiach to Masiach. Masiach means to speak. And Mashiach means the anointed one, the one who's going to save us all and transform the world forever. So speaking about Mashiach accelerates the process of Mashiach, and we should be Zeicher Mirz Hashem to the end of the Galut dream and the beginning of the fulfillment of all the prophecies and the beautiful new world that we're going to live in together. May it be b'mehera u'b'yameinu. Amen. Thank you for joining. Laila Tov.